22 minutes. That's how long it took D Squadron 22 SAS to descend from the sky, storm a fortified rebel compound deep inside the West African jungle, fight their way through a militia estimated at between 100 and 200 armed fighters, and walk out carrying 6 British soldiers and 21 Sierra Leonean civilians who should not have survived the morning. 22 minutes from the moment the first Chinook helicopter crossed the river to the moment the last hostage was airborne and out of reach. At a coalition command post approximately 50 kilometers away, American military observers with access to the communications loop were watching the plan develop. They had questions. They wanted coordination calls. They wanted confirmation that certain escalation thresholds had been cleared. They wanted permission structures documented. By the time those questions were being formulated, it was already over. A senior American officer present during the planning phase, whose name has never been publicly confirmed, later remarked to a British counterpart that in the United States Special Operations community, the approval chain for an operation of that scale against a force of that size in that terrain would have taken a minimum of 72 hours to navigate from concept to launch authority. The British had done it in 16. The response from the British officer was characteristically understated. He said, "We didn't have 72 hours." That exchange, confirmed in broad terms by multiple accounts from journalists, military historians, and officers involved in the planning, captures something essential about Operation Barras. It was not merely a hostage rescue. It was a demonstration of what happens when you strip away every layer of institutional hesitation and leave only the question that actually matters. Can these men do this job? The answer, delivered at dawn on September 10, 2000, into a jungle compound on the banks of the Rockall Creek in Sierra Leone, was one of the most emphatic in the history of British special operations. To understand why Operation Barras was necessary, you have to understand Sierra Leone in the year 2000. And to understand Sierra Leone in the year 2000, you have to understand what 9 years of civil war does to a country whose institutions were already fragile before the first shot was fired. The war had begun in 1991 when the Revolutionary United Front, the RUF, backed by Liberian warlord Charles Taylor, and armed with weapons filtered through a web of West African criminal networks, invaded from Liberia's eastern border. What followed was not warfare in any conventional sense. It was industrialized savagery. The RUF's signature tactic was the deliberate amputation of civilian limbs, not as a method of killing, as a message. They moved through villages with machetes and held votes among the population on whether they preferred long sleeves or short sleeves, the terminology for amputation at the wrist versus the elbow. Children were conscripted at gunpoint, forced to kill their own parents as a means of severing the psychological ties that would otherwise compel them to run home. By 2000, an estimated 50,000 Sierra Leoneans had been killed and over 2 million displaced. The country's diamond-producing regions had been captured and turned into a funding engine for continued atrocity. Into this had come the West Side Boys. They occupied a specific niche in Sierra Leone's ecosystem of violence that was distinct from the RUF and more chaotic for it. The West Side Boys were nominally affiliated with the government, having originally formed from remnants of the Sierra Leone Army. But by 2000, their loyalty was to nothing except their own leader, a 25-year-old who called himself Brigadier Fode Calais, and to the pharmaceutical cocktail of drugs and alcohol that their fighters consumed in quantities that rendered them functionally immune to fear. Their base at Gabaribana on the north bank of the Rockall Creek was a compound of mud-walled huts in dense jungle roughly 70 kilometers east of the capital Freetown. Across the river, 100 meters of water away, they controlled a second village called Magbeni. Between these two positions, they had established a fiefdom of perhaps 100 to 200 fighters, armed with AK-47 rifles, RPG, 7 rocket-propelled grenade launchers, heavy machine guns mounted on vehicles, and a collective volatility shaped by the near-continuous ingestion of palm wine, marijuana, heroin, and packets of raw gin that their fighters gulped down on empty stomachs before dawn. They were undisciplined in the traditional military sense. They were not undisciplined in the traditional sense of dangerous. Drug-fueled combatants who had survived years of civil war, who had been killing people since adolescence, and who had structured their entire social identity around the performance of violence, were dangerous in a way that no training exercise could fully prepare a soldier for. They did not respond to threat assessment in predictable ways. They might surrender. They might charge into a machine gun. They might execute the hostages before an assault force reached the building. That uncertainty was the central planning problem for Operation Barras. And it was real. On August 25, 2000, a patrol from the 1st Battalion, the Royal Irish Regiment, left their base at Waterloo heading for the Jordanian peacekeeping contingent at Masiaka. The patrol consisted of 11 soldiers under Major Alan Marshall and a Sierra Leone Army liaison officer, Lieutenant Musa Bangura. The route was familiar. The road was used regularly. What happened next happened because of a single navigation decision, a turn down a track toward the village of Magbeni that brought the patrol directly into West Side Boys territory. The West Side Boys surrounded the vehicles immediately. Outgunned and surrounded in terrain they couldn't fight through, Marshall made the correct decision. He surrendered. The soldiers were stripped of their weapons, their equipment, and their dignity, and transported to Geberi Bana. Within hours, they were being paraded before Fode Calais, who informed them that they were now his property. The demands he issued to the British government were a menu of the delusional: the release of political prisoners, financial compensation, recognition of his authority. Each demand contradicted the previous one. Each negotiation session produced new conditions. The British quickly understood that Calais was not negotiating in good faith. He was performing for his own fighters, demonstrating his power to hold the British Army hostage and do nothing about it. For the soldiers themselves, the experience was one of sustained psychological assault layered on top of physical deprivation. They were housed in cramped, mud-walled huts in conditions that oscillated between sweltering heat during the day and chill damp after dark. Their rations were inadequate and inconsistent. Medical attention was denied. They were subjected to mock executions, brought out at gunpoint and lined up as though about to be shot, the trigger pulled on an empty chamber, and then returned to their hut while their captors laughed. This technique, refined by armed groups across several decades and several continents, is specifically designed to destroy the psychological coherence that captives need to maintain hope and collective strength. The British military was monitoring their condition as closely as the intelligence assets permitted. Every report from every source was fed into the planning process, not just as raw intelligence about the enemy, but as an assessment of how much longer the hostages could endure their circumstances without irreversible psychological or physical harm. The British government, operating under a principle that has guided every hostage situation since the Iranian embassy siege in 1980, would not make deals with hostage takers, but they would negotiate long enough to gather intelligence and prepare a military option. 5 of the soldiers were released through negotiation on September 3rd after 8 days of captivity. The remaining 6, plus their Sierra Leonean liaison officer, stayed at Geberi Bana, 6 men, in a jungle compound, surrounded by between 100 and 200 armed fighters who had been drinking since breakfast. Before a single trigger was pulled, before a single helicopter left the ground, the intelligence operation that would make the rescue possible had already been running for days. SAS reconnaissance teams had been inserted clandestinely into the jungle around Geberi Bana and Magbeni using inflatable raiding craft under cover of darkness on the Rokel Creek. These were boat troop specialists from D Squadron, men trained in the precise art of moving through water at night without detection. placing their craft against riverbanks with the care of surgeons, stepping into mud up to their knees and holding the side of the boat still, while a man stepped over the gunwale without splashing. From concealed positions in dense vegetation, sometimes within meters of the West Side Boys' perimeter, these observation teams watched. They cataloged the enemy's habits, the time the sentries changed, which buildings the hostages were held in, which routes through the compound the rebels used most frequently, where the heavy weapons were positioned, how many fighters were at each location at different times of day. They used parabolic microphones to listen to conversations happening inside buildings they could not see. They photographed everything. They reported back via encrypted burst transmissions that lasted less than 3 seconds, reducing the possibility of electronic detection to near zero. By the time the assault plan was being finalized, the SAS knew Beribana as well as its own compound at Hereford. They had drawn the layout from memory. They had identified the precise hut where the 6 Royal Irish soldiers were being held. They had mapped every sentry position, every weapons cache, every potential threat axis. One detail that illustrates the precision of this intelligence work, the reconnaissance teams had established not just where the hostages were held, but which direction the door of their hut opened, which side of the building had a window, and whether there was a sentry posted outside it at different times of night. This was not intelligence gathered from satellites or drones. It was intelligence gathered by men lying in mud 10 meters from an enemy perimeter, controlling their breathing, controlling their heart rate, holding the same position for hours because a single sound could end the operation and everyone in it. The observation teams had also tracked the daily rhythms of the West Side Boys with the patience that only men trained in exactly this discipline can sustain. They knew that the fighters were at their most alert in the mid-afternoon. They knew that the combination of alcohol and drugs caused a collective slump in the small hours of the morning that left sentries drowsy and reactive capacity degraded. They knew, in other words, not just where to hit, but when. This was the foundation. Without it, Operation Barras would have been a different story, possibly a catastrophic one. The planning cell for Operation Barras worked under a specific constraint that sharpened every decision. The intelligence was time-sensitive, and the intelligence suggested the hostages situation was deteriorating. Calais' demands were becoming more erratic, his fighters were becoming harder to control, and reports from the observation team suggested that the treatment of the hostages was worsening. There were indications that the remaining Royal Irish soldiers might be moved to a more remote location, or that Calais might choose to execute one of them as a demonstration of seriousness. The British government under Prime Minister Tony Blair faced a calculation that had no comfortable answer: authorize the military option and accept the possibility of British casualties in what one SAS officer described in a post-operation debrief as the most dangerous type of hostage rescue environment I had encountered. Meaning a large, well-armed, drug-affected, unpredictable enemy force in dense terrain with limited helicopter landing areas and a killing ground between the landing zone and the hostage location that offered essentially no cover. Decline the military option and watch the situation deteriorate until a hostage was executed, at which point public and political pressure would force an even more rushed operation under even worse conditions. Blair authorized the operation. He did so accepting projections that in worst-case scenarios, British casualties could reach dozens, particularly if a Chinook was shot down over the compound with 60 Special Forces soldiers aboard. The plan had 2 simultaneous elements. D Squadron, 22 SAS, supported by elements of the Special Boat Service integrated into their fire teams, would assault Beribana directly. Their objective was the hostages. They would fast rope from Chinook helicopters into the compound, secure the hostage building immediately, and fight outward from there. Simultaneously, a company of the 1st Battalion, the Parachute Regiment, would assault Mogbeni across the river. Their task was not to take the village for its own sake, Their task was to prevent the 60 to 80 West Side boys stationed there from crossing the river and reinforcing the Biribana compound while the SAS was inside it. If those fighters crossed the Rokel Creek with heavy weapons while D Squadron was still in the middle of a close-quarter battle, the numbers could become unmanageable. Air support would be provided by Lynx Mk-7 attack helicopters from 657 Squadron, Army Air Corps, armed with miniguns, and a single MiL-24 Hind gunship provided by friendly local forces. The Lynxes would suppress enemy heavy weapons positions on their approach. Targeting the crew served machine guns that posed the greatest threat to the assault helicopters. The Hind would provide additional fire support along the river banks. The timing was calculated around the fundamental principle of hostage rescue operations that had been established by every SAS operation from the Iranian embassy in 1980 onward. The assault force had to reach the hostages before the enemy could react to their presence and execute them. That meant speed. It meant complete commitment from the moment the first helicopter crossed the river. And it meant choosing a time when the West Side boys would be at their lowest alertness. Dawn on September 10, 2000 was selected. Early enough that the darkness of the approach would provide cover. Light enough that the assault teams could see without relying entirely on night vision. And a time of morning when a force that had been drinking until the small hours would be at the nadir of its cognitive function. The helicopters were pre-positioned. The assault teams were briefed to a level of detail that one SAS operator later described as knowing the compound by feel. They had studied the aerial imagery and the reconnaissance team's sketches until the layout was architectural memory. They knew which doorway opened to which room. They knew where not to step. D Squadron rehearsed. And rehearsed. The killing house at Hereford does not prepare you for a specific target environment. The rehearsals in country did. At 6:16 in the morning on September 10, 2000, the assault force crossed the Rokel Creek. The Lynx helicopters went in first, suppressing the heavy weapons positions that the observation teams had identified. The miniguns on the Lynxies deliver rounds at a rate that turns a fixed defensive position from an asset into a liability within seconds. The sound of them alone, the deep mechanical roar that soldiers who have been near them describe as something closer to a physical sensation than a noise, was enough to shatter sleep and disorient anyone trying to organize a defensive response. The Chinooks came in directly behind, not circling, not hovering cautiously at the perimeter. Straight in. D Squadron fast roped directly into Biribana. The technique requires the operator to grip a thick rope and slide from the helicopter to the ground in a controlled descent, letting friction do the braking work, covering 40 feet in a few seconds. It is not slow. The first operators were on the ground and moving before the last ones had released the rope. What this looked like from the ground, if you were a West Side boy sentry who had been sleeping in a chair outside a hut at 6 in the morning after a night of palm wine, was approximately this. A wall of rotor noise that arrived before you had time to process it as aircraft, followed by the concussive percussion of minigun fire from the Lynxes suppressing the heavy weapons emplacements, followed by dark shapes descending from a Chinook that was already banking away for its extraction run. The interval between first sound and first contact was measured in seconds. The West Side boys had faced the Sierra Leone Army. They had faced rough fighters. They had faced UN peacekeepers standing in their way. They had not faced D Squadron, 22 SAS, arriving simultaneously at multiple points on their perimeter with the deliberate violence of men who had rehearsed this exact compound from memory. The priority was the hostage building. Every rehearsal, every intelligence briefing, every planning session had been organized around a single question. How fast can we get from the rope to that building? The SAS reached the hostages before the West Side boys could organize a coherent response to execute them. This was the decisive achievement of the entire operation. Everything else that morning, the firefight that followed, the air support, the Barras' assault on Mogbeni, the clearing of the compound, the extraction, all of it was secondary to that single accomplishment. If the hostages had been killed in the first 60 seconds, the operation would have been a tactical success and a strategic disaster. They were not killed. They were alive. They were frightened and physically depleted after 17 days in captivity, having endured beatings, mock executions, and the sustained psychological weight of not knowing whether each morning would be their last. But they were alive, and D Squadron had them. What followed the initial breach of the hostage building was a firefight that, by the accounts of participants, was as close and violent as anything D Squadron had encountered in recent memory. The West Side boys were armed, they were high, and some of them charged toward the sounds of the assault rather than away from them, in the narrow lanes between the compound's mud-walled huts, with visibility measured in meters and muzzle flash serving as navigation. D Squadron cleared Biribana room by room, hut by hut, moving in the four-man formations that had been trained to the point of physical reflex in the killing house at Hereford. Across the river, the Barras hit Magbeni with the kind of violence of action that the parachute regiment has historically delivered in conditions that most military units would describe as prohibitive. They came in under fire from heavy machine guns. They came in over swampy ground in the pre-dawn half-light with West Side boys on rooftops and in tree lines. They came in anyway, and they cleared Magbeni, and they held the riverbank, and the Biribana compound was never reinforced from across the Rokel Creek. 22 minutes from the crossing of the river to the departure of the last Chinook with the last hostage aboard. By the time the dust settled, at least 25 West Side boys were dead. 18 had been captured, including Fode Calais himself, dragged out of the chaos and handed over to Jordanian UN troops, who transferred him to Sierra Leonean police custody. His ragged army had been shattered, its leadership decapitated, its base taken apart in the time it takes to eat breakfast. One British soldier died in the operation, Lance Corporal Brad Tinian of D Squadron, 22 SAS, who was wounded during the assault on Biribana and died of his wounds despite emergency treatment. He was 26 years old. He is commemorated on the Clock Tower Memorial at SAS headquarters in Hereford, the regiment's primary tribute to its fallen. Several more British soldiers, both SAS and Barras, were wounded. None of the 6 Royal Irish hostages or their Sierra Leonean liaison officer was killed. 21 Sierra Leonean civilians who had been held prisoner by the West Side boys were also freed. The American observers present during the planning and execution of Operation Barras were watching something they had not been designed to watch, a military operation conducted at a planning and execution speed that sat outside the parameters of what their own institutional framework considered achievable. This is not a criticism of the American military. The American Special Operations Command by 2000 was the most technologically sophisticated fighting force in human history. Its planning and approval processes were built on experience, and that experience had taught it that rushed operations got people killed. The 72-hour planning cycle that one American officer referenced was not bureaucratic timidity. It was a hard lesson from operations that had gone wrong. But the West Side boys did not give the British 72 hours. The intelligence window did not stay open for 72 hours. The hostages' safety could not be guaranteed for 72 hours. The British made a different calculation, not because they were cavalier about risk, but because their institutional culture had been shaped by 60 years of operating in precisely these conditions, the conditions where the standard planning timeline is a luxury that the situation cannot afford. The SAS had first been deployed in exactly this type of problem in 1952 in Malaya, where 4-man patrols were operating in deep jungle against communist guerrillas with a planning and execution tempo that conventional military units of the era found incomprehensible. They had refined it in Borneo in the 1960s, in Oman in the 1970s, in Northern Ireland from 1969 onward, and at the Iranian Embassy in 1980, where the planning cycle from initial deployment to execution was measured in days rather than weeks, and the execution itself took 17 minutes. At every stage, the lesson was the same. In hostage rescue, the planning cycle is bounded by the hostage's safety, not by institutional comfort. By 2000, D Squadron had been training for operations like Barras for their entire careers. The selection process had identified them as men capable of functioning under the compressed timelines and extreme stress that characterized this type of operation. The continuation training had equipped them with the specific skills needed. The rehearsals in country had given them the specific knowledge of the target. The reconnaissance teams had given them the intelligence. Everything was in place. What the Americans were observing, in other words, was not improvisation. It was the product of an institutional system that had been building toward exactly this capability since David Sterling first assembled L Detachment in North Africa in 1941. The question of permission was not a question the British were asking because they had already done the work that made the operation possible. Permission structures exist to catch the variables that planning has missed. The British had not missed variables. They had found them all, cataloged them, prepared for each one, and they had gone. Understanding Operation Barras requires understanding the system that produced the men who executed it. D Squadron, 22 SAS did not walk into Gabiribana because they were brave. Bravery is a universal human quality. They walked in because they were the product of a selection and training system that had specifically engineered their ability to function at maximum effectiveness in the most chaotic environment that ground combat can produce. SAS selection begins at Sennybridge Training Camp in the Brecon Beacons, South Wales. Candidates arrive from every regiment and corps in the British Army, already having passed fitness standards that would eliminate most applicants to special operations units worldwide. What awaits them is something that fitness standards cannot prepare you for. The Hills phase lasts 4 weeks. Candidates navigate alone between grid references across some of the most demanding terrain in Western Europe, the exposed ridgelines and bog-filled valleys of the Brecon Beacons and Black Mountains, carrying rucksacks that increase in weight from 25 kilograms in the first week to over 30 kilograms by the final tests. The time limits for each leg of the navigation are never disclosed. You cannot pace yourself against a known target because there is no known target. There is only maximum effort until the checkpoint is reached or missed. The culminating event is a solo navigation march of approximately 64 kilometers across the full width of the Brecon Beacons, carrying the same load, to be completed in under 20 hours. It must be completed alone. There is no resupply, no support, no encouragement, and no second chance if the weather turns, the navigation fails, or the body simply refuses. Of every 100 to 200 candidates who begin a typical selection cycle, between 140 and 170 are gone before test week. Not because they are unfit, although some are. Because the Brecon Beacons in winter, in driving rain, in fog so thick that a candidate cannot see the compass in their own hand, in temperatures that hover above zero and below it in the same 12-hour period, have a way of identifying the precise line that separates the man who can function when his body has categorically refused, and the man who cannot. The directing staff do not beg or motivate. They record arrival times at checkpoints. If you make it, you continue. If you don't, you're put on a truck and driven back to Sennybridge, and that is the end of it. Those who survive the hills move to continuation training, a phase lasting approximately 14 months that covers advanced demolitions, combat medicine to paramedic standard, signals, languages, and close-quarter battle in the regiment's purpose-built killing house at Hereford. By the time a candidate is badged, he has fired an estimated 5,000 rounds in close-quarter scenarios using live ammunition, clearing rooms with mannequins representing hostages and threats, making the life-and-death discriminatory shooting decisions required in hostage rescue environments so many thousands of times that the process moves from conscious calculation to physical reflex. The men who fast-roped into Giberibana had done this, all of them. Every operator in D Squadron that morning had been through exactly this system, and many of them had already operated in Northern Ireland, where the SAS had spent 30 years conducting covert surveillance and direct action operations in environments where a mistake meant not just personal death, but the death of others. That operational history, that accumulated institutional weight, came with them across the Roquel Creek at dawn. It is what the Americans were watching. They could count the helicopters and the personnel. They could monitor the radio traffic. What they could not quantify was the thing that made those specific men different from other soldiers who were also brave and also committed and also willing to die for the mission. The thing that cannot be bought with budgets or issued with equipment. The 14 months of training. The 5,000 rounds in the killing house. The 30 years of Northern Ireland institutional memory. The selection process that had identified, out of every generation of the British Army, the specific type of human being who could make the right decision in the dark in a 2-meter-wide jungle alley, with an enemy weapon firing from 5 meters away. That was what went into Giberibana. That was what came out with the hostages. The aftermath of Operation Barras was more consequential than the immediate headlines suggested. The West Side Boys as a functioning military organization ceased to exist on September 10, 2000. Within a fortnight of the operation, more than 300 West Side Boys fighters had surrendered to United Nations forces in the area. Fode Calais was tried for high treason in Sierra Leone, convicted, and eventually released after serving part of his sentence. His organization never recovered. More significantly, the British intervention as a whole, of which Operation Barras was the sharpest expression, stabilized Sierra Leone at a moment when the country was genuinely in danger of complete state collapse. The combination of British military presence, training support, and demonstrated willingness to use decisive force against any party that threatened British personnel or civilian populations sent a message that the RUF and every other armed faction in the country was capable of understanding. The war in Sierra Leone was formally declared over in January 2002, 17 months after Operation Barras. The operation also had a specific and lasting effect on how the British and American Special Operations communities understood each other's capabilities. In the years that followed, particularly during the intensification of operations in Afghanistan and Iraq after 2001, the relationship between the SAS and American Special Operations units, primarily Delta Force and later SEAL Team 6, was built partly on the foundation of what both sides had learned from observing each other in operations like Barras. The American community took note of the speed at which the British had planned and executed. The British took note of the technological and logistical resources the Americans could bring to bear. The template that emerged from this cross-pollination, the rapid intelligence exploitation cycle, the compressed planning timeline, the integration of reconnaissance elements directly into assault planning, became the architectural framework of coalition special operations in both Iraq and Afghanistan through the following decade. But the origin point, the place where the template was stress-tested in its most raw and unadorned form against the most chaotic and unpredictable enemy in the most difficult terrain, with the most compressed planning timeline and the highest stakes, was a compound on the banks of the Roquel Creek in Sierra Leone at dawn on September 10, 2000, in 22 minutes. The Americans wanted permission. The British wanted the hostages. And the difference between those two orientations, between an institutional culture built on the principle that you must account for every variable before you move, and an institutional culture built on the principle that you must be capable enough to handle the variables as they emerge, was the difference between a 72-hour planning cycle and a 16-hour planning cycle, and the difference between hostages who might not have survived another 72 hours and 6 Royal Irish soldiers who flew home. There is a precise thing that Operation Barras demonstrated that no amount of institutional analysis or after-action review has been able to simplify into a comfortable single lesson, because the lesson is not comfortable. The lesson is that there is a category of military problem, narrow but real, where the size of the force is a liability before it is an asset, where the sophistication of the supporting technology creates noise in the decision cycle, where the comprehensiveness of the planning process creates the illusion of control over variables that cannot be controlled, and where the only reliable instrument available is a small number of men who have been specifically selected and specifically trained to function without any of that support, in any environment, against any enemy, under any degree of stress, until the mission is complete. The West Side Boys had spent years adapting to the Sierra Leone Army, to the RUF, to UN peacekeepers, to the various armed factions whose tactical approaches they had encountered and survived. They had not adapted to 60 men fast roping from the sky in the dark, reaching the hostage building before a coherent response could be organized, and clearing the compound from inside out. Because you cannot adapt to something when the window between the moment it arrives and the moment it succeeds is measured in seconds. The 17-day ordeal of the Royal Irish soldiers ended in 22 minutes, not because the British were lucky and not because the West Side Boys were incompetent. It ended in 22 minutes because a system that had been building this exact capability since 1941 had produced on that morning in Sierra Leone exactly what it was designed to produce: men who could go through the door in the dark, in the jungle, without waiting for permission. Brad Tinian was 26 years old. He came from Carlisle. He had passed one of the most demanding selection courses on Earth and spent his service in one of its most elite units. He went through a doorway in a jungle compound in West Africa to bring home 6 men he had never met, and he did not come back. The 6 soldiers of the Royal Irish Regiment came home. 21 Sierra Leonean civilians came home. The operation is still regarded, more than 2 decades later, as one of the finest executed hostage rescues in the history of special operations warfare. Not because it was perfect, because it was necessary, because it was possible, and because the men sent to do it had spent their entire careers becoming exactly capable enough to make it so. The Americans wanted permission. The British sent the helicopters. And those 22 minutes are still being studied at Fort Liberty, at Sandhurst, at the Australian SASR base at Campbell Barracks, and at SAS headquarters at Hereford, because in 22 minutes in a West African jungle, a principle was proven that no budget can buy and no technology can replicate. The right men in the right place at the right time, without waiting for the paperwork, that is the system. That is the legacy. That is why you never ever make Fode Calais' mistake. Don't take the British hostage.